We're honored today not to have one, but two esteemed guests. They are the co-authors of a book called Fixing Failed States, a framework for rebuilding a fractured world, a book that was published in May by Oxford University Press. Our guests are Ashrap Gani and Claire Lockhart. Ashrap Gani played a central role in the design and implementation of the post-Taliban settlement in Afghanistan, serving as the UN advisor to the bond process and as finance minister during that country's transitional administration. He is currently chair of the Institute for State Effectiveness, a relatively new institute working to solve the failed state problem around the world. He's joined today by his colleague, Claire Lockhart. Claire is director of the Institute for State Effectiveness, and she has worked for the World Bank, the United Nations, and also advised the government of Afghanistan in Kabul on its strategy and programs between 2002 and 2005. Please welcome Ashrap Gani and Claire Lockhart.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. I'd like to begin with a place that you know quite well and has contributed a very distinctive term. The place is Ireland, and the term that they've come with is called reversing history. And the reason you're so significant to that development is that prior to the advent of modern technology, Ireland was the pariah of Europe. For about 100 years, every social thinker in Europe has had racist remarks to make about Ireland. Today, of course, nobody makes those remarks because Ireland is Tory. And its current prime minister, then finance minister, came with this frame, reversing history, namely that a history of deprivation, neglect, and actual failure to deliver basic services to the citizens can be overcome. Ireland is not alone in this. If we look into the last 60 years, one side is a story of despair. Genocide, ethnocide, major failures, etc. But another is a story of really major transformation as to how tremendous amount of prosperity has been unleashed. So let me just mention some of these examples. The first of these is Europe. Europe in 1947 was a place where the threat of starvation was everywhere and pervasive. Europe, of course, was the place that had one of its most important members, namely Germany, had liquidated 6 million of its own citizens. From that to today is a remarkable transformation. Europe is democratic. Europe, for the first time in 400 years, is not a threat to the rest of the world. It's true. And actually quite peaceful, given their history of expansionism. And to be described as slightly effeminate by George Bush is really quite a compliment to them, given their history. But how did Europe do it? Two fundamental things. One, an enormous act of statesmanship by the United States through the Marshall Plan. Second, the concept of overcoming national sovereignty through creating something that at first looked incredibly modest, namely a community of steel and coal. Because steel and coal had divided Germany and France. By coming together to build a win-win rather than a lose-lose proposition, Europe unleashed what we now have today in what we call network sovereignty, namely a community where the traditional notion of the state has been reframed along very novel ways of building. A second example would be equally surprising to you because it's much closer, and that's the American South. The southern states of the United States, for close to 100 years after the Civil War, were the site of some of the most racist, exclusionary politics of denial of basic rights to citizens just based on the color of their skin. Governor Wallace of Alabama said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and unleashed police dogs on children and posted troops in front of schools to prevent them from going to school. Something that today, you would associate with Sudan or Zimbabwe. Alabama last year had $9 billion in tourist revenue. Georgia, if it were an independent country, would be the 17th largest economy in the world. North Carolina has become the center of massive scientific creativity through the research triangle. This, again, is an example where history of neglect can change. Today, the southern states have 93% of the income of the northern states. And that, I think, explains the success of Senator Obama, why a new politics of citizenship can be started. Singapore and Spain, again, offer two different examples of transformation. The story of Singapore probably is really very interesting because it has nothing. In the way of natural resources, it doesn't even have drinking water. That is to import it. But yet, it even makes money from export of drinking water back again by purifying it. But one story captures how Singapore positioned itself. Singapore today is one of the most significant global players in finance. How did it develop this? By realizing that there was a time gap between San Francisco closing and Zurich opening. Banking then was not global. Having realized that, it created the entire institutional mechanism to assure the world banking community and finance that could step in. So these are sort of examples that allow us to say we actually know how to build effective states. Because the refrain that commonly you hear, it's too difficult. It cannot be done. We have never done it before. One of our main contentions in this book is that by not knowing the history of our successes, we actually deny ourselves the sense of freedom and the opportunity that comes from that learning on those successes. Why does it matter to know that we have succeeded in the past? Because today, there's a challenge that 40 to 60 countries are not functioning. These are the places that are at the heart of instability, poverty, disease, gender bias, and exclusion. How did these places come to be what they are? A very simple answer. They are the debris of the Cold War. The Cold War was a balance of terror because of nuclear arms race between two systems that actually realized that they could not use nuclear weapons against each other. So they unleashed a series of so-called small wars in other places. And when the Berlin Wall collapsed and then the Soviet Union imploded, this debris that previously had been kept artificially together by one side or the other started unraveling. The world neglected this problem, and one of its major outcomes was, of course, witnessed in New York on 9/11. A small group of people took a country mine hostage and launched the most devastating attack on the soil of the United States from one of the second poorest country onward. So because of this, we need to understand that security cannot be through a fortress Europe or a fortress United States. The world of flows, at the center of which are you with unleashing the information revolution, cannot be boxed in again. We live in one world. And given the environmental challenge, we must live in one world because the nature of solutions to the environmental issue or to the issue of knowledge and disease and others cannot be national. The two countries that, of course, grab the headlines are Iraq and Afghanistan constantly. But we need to realize that at least 1 billion people of facing this problem. And 4 billion people around the world have no access to the rule of law. That takes something very simple like property rights. 4 billion people around the world do not have access to secure property rights. So they have to struggle continuously for those assets. If this is the problem, what assets do we have? What problems have we had to deal with a problem of this magnitude? The first thing to realize is that our world today is not the world of 1945. Why do I need to invoke 1945? Because most of our international institutions and our key notions regarding how governments function are derived from 1945. What was the world of 1945 and what is the world today? First, the world of 1945 had a deep distrust of globalization. Because of the Great Depression, the people who designed the economic system after 1945 imposed currency controls, imposed controls on information. Everything was supposed to be national. National economies, national politics, national boundaries. And flows would not be trusted because depression, which was the outcome of the first phase of globalization, had brought such insecurity. Second, it was a world of governments. You know, the entire number of non-governmental organizations in 1945 was around 60, and that included the Postal Union. And three, of course, information was deeply controlled. I mean, you could impose censorship, you could control radios, you jam radios, etc. It was not a world of flows. Today, by contrast, the world that we are living in is a world of flows. What's an example of this? $6,500 trillion a year circulate through the global financial system alone. And if you travel as much as I do, unfortunately, it's a tax, because I don't know which continent I am a particular day of the week, just the system of trust that makes us move through space and time, or the network of communication, through which now people expect us to respond within hours, mostly probably minutes. I'm still having some degree of freedom. Because of this, the relationship between the state, the market, and the citizen is radically different. Take one item again where you have been so important. Information was the most expensive commodity for around 400 years. What the technology revolution in information has managed is to geometrically reduce the cost of information. Then the technology revolution has fundamentally changed the nature of relationship between information, knowledge, and wisdom. Because in past, university education was about commanding certain amount of information. An engineer that was trained in 1940s could be expected to practice through the 1960s with minimal of retraining. I mean, of course, take somebody now with a degree in computer sciences, 6 months, obsolescence, or is it slightly more? This fundamental change brings about a very different possibility of relation between citizens and the information flows. And also, of course, in a world where information now can be accessed, the key is how do we train people to recognize patterns? And how do we change policy on a basis where information is not the constraint? So the full implications of this, two things, and before I hand over to my colleague. One is governance has to be thought through as network governance, not as old hierarchy. Hierarchy is still required to solve certain problems, but the key is, for instance, who's the client? And this question was probably best answered in the state of Washington because the fish were disappearing. And had the fish disappeared, the rules would have kicked in from a variety of places that would have really literally meant shutting down all the rivers in the state of Washington. And so they had to define who was the client. And once they defined the client as the fish, the nature of coordination and cooperation that was required by a myriad of agencies, there were about 60 agencies that needed to cooperate in this, then became subject of a very different kind of governance arrangement. And it's in that governance arrangement that we can rethink about collaborating in solving certain problems. So globalization in this regard, instead of being seen as the threat that dislocates and just disrupts Schumpeter's frame, creative destruction, can actually be seen as a knowledge base that allows us to connect the disconnected parts. Now I'll hand over to my colleague who will touch on the framework. Claire.
Thank you. What we seek to do with this book is to propose a framework to answer the question, what does the state do in the 21st century? And as we've been going around this country talking about the book, we find that this is a question actually that isn't just about Iraq and Afghanistan and countries facing huge challenges in state building. It's as relevant to the US, to advanced countries in Europe. It's the question that the senators themselves are asking. What does the state do in the 21st century? But it is particularly relevant if you're standing on the rubble in Kabul or in Mogadishu, or in countries like Haiti and Liberia. What does the state actually do? What are you trying to build? And what we've done in the book is to propose a framework of the 10 functions that the state must perform in the 21st century. And we're not talking about a top-down repressive kind of state. We're talking more about the state as a mechanism, as a device to ensure that these functions are performed with the key objective of service to citizens. So one of the key parts of this is that it's a citizen-focused agenda. The book lists the 10. It could have been 9, it could have been 11, and it isn't meant to provide a cookie cutter. It's meant to be a starting point for a debate. We convened a group of leaders of post-conflict transitions, and they actually wanted to add 2 more. They said that transitional justice was really important for them. And they wanted to add another one, which was the ability of the state to manage disaster. So particularly in a country like Rwanda or Liberia, that you're not always dependent on the outside agencies coming in when you do have a disaster. The exact disaster may not be predictable, that they know they are going to have disasters they need to cope with. You'll have to read the book for the full 10. I'll illustrate a few of them now. The first of these I'd like to point to is the management of public finances, and related to that, the management of the assets of the state. And one thing we've noticed is really strange. Companies have balance sheets. Countries don't. They look at the cash flow, the P&L, but they don't have a balance sheet of the assets of the country year on year. How has the leadership of the country managed to manage the land? Have they sold it? Have they invested in it? The forests, the water. And all this is really important in an age where environmentalism is so much concern to all of us. But also, these assets are worth money, and it affects the balance sheet, the assets of the country that belong to the citizens as to how they manage them year on year. Do they sell a license for GSM, for telecoms, for $1, or do they manage to get $1 billion for it? And then what are those assets used for? So we're proposing that there should be some kind of framework to measure and manage those assets over time. Even the brand of the country is worth something, and have the leadership manage to make the most of the brand of that country. A second example, provision of infrastructure services. And as you'll all know very well, in the technology industry, the infrastructure, the hardware that has to go behind the provision of communications flow is really important. So it's not just it's a communications infrastructure that we must all think about today, but it's also the network of power, of water, of transportation, and how that all fits together. And that's another function that's really important to perform. Third, and what we argue is really the basis of the other functions, is the rule of law. And it binds the rest together. And we see rules as resources in themselves. And I think anyone who's been in charge of spending a budget would know that you could have tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, but unless you have the right rules for procurement and accounting and so on, you can't spend that money effectively. But looking at the rule of law as a system that underpins the rest is really important. And finally, another function we look at is the formation of the market. For a long time, and still some economists argue that if you just get the state out of the way, the market will flourish. And I think we all know from the recent subprime crisis that that's not the case, that the market can run to excess. In a post-conflict condition, sometimes that argument has been made, either get the state out of the way and the market will flourish, or the market and the economy can wait till later, that the important thing is humanitarian assistance for a number of years. We participated in a recent meeting where the leaders of putting peace agreements together all sat together and they realized, oh my goodness, we forgot about the market. We left it till later, but what happened? We left it till later, and instead of getting a flourishing market, we got a criminal mafia. And what happened then, the criminal mafia then influences the governance arrangements and the leadership, and then the governance falls apart and you go back into civil war again. So really looking at what are the building blocks, what are the institutional building blocks to make a market function is another really important dimension. I won't go on now, it's fully described in the book. What are we doing wrong in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and the 40 to 60 countries that we argue are at the heart of this crisis? We're not putting this state-building framework or a similar one at the center. Rather, what we see is what we call the double failure. On the one hand, there's a failure of the national governments in these places, and we term it the sovereignty gap. The international system assumes that the states, which are the functioning units of the international system, are fully functional, but in fact, they're not performing these functions, and therefore there's this sovereignty gap. Anyone who lives in New York will know about the UN annual meetings when it's impossible to get a hotel or move around town by taxi, and the bigger the plane of the delegation, the presidential delegation visiting from one of these countries, usually the more dysfunctional their governance, because the more money, taxpayers' money, they're wasting on these enormous delegations, bodyguards, and so on. And we see this really as symptomatic. This annual ritual of theatre is symptomatic of their failure to perform back home in their countries for their citizens. So that's the first failure. And the second failure we see is the failure of the international system, and particularly within that, what we call the aid complex, in responding to the problems on the ground. Enormous generosity of taxpayers around the world, putting billions of dollars into the aid system, whether it's contractors or UN agencies or NGOs. And whilst there are very admirable people working within these systems and some great examples of projects within it, the net effect can be quite damaging. Why is that? A number of reasons. The way that contracting works means that often an aid project will be contracted through several layers. And by the time the money reaches the bottom, there may be only 10 or 20 cents on the dollar getting anywhere near the country. The rest is going in layers and layers of overheads. Another problem, the projects that are set up create what we call parallel organizations to the health system or the education system in the country concerned. And they set up parallel organizations of lots of small projects that draw away the capacity from people working who might otherwise have been doctors or teachers in the health system, become drivers and assistants and translators for these projects. So it actually might end up causing more system damage. And then a failure of accountability. Because the projects are contracted to aid agencies in faraway capitals, there's really no accountability to the citizens on the ground. So if you're living in a village and your teacher is illiterate, or the school roof falls in, who do you complain to? You can't pick up the phone to Washington. It's not just a problem with the US assistance, it's the same in Britain, it's the same in Japan. But there's no mechanism of accountability. So we argue that we really need to look at the mechanisms of the way the aid complex operates. There's certainly a need for money. But the money isn't being spent in the right way. And it's not just money. In this context of globalization, there's an enormous range of assets that can be brought to the task. The last thing I want to talk about is the view from the field. what we're putting in this book isn't just theory. In fact, it's a set of principles that have been derived from first-hand experience. Dr. Gani was called on to be the sort of key advisor to the Bonn process, the Bonn Agreement in Afghanistan, and then became Minister of Finance and led a team who put together a different approach. And a group of us stood in the rubble after the Taliban had been routed out of Kabul and thought about how do you build a legitimate authority? How do you build a state? And we asked the UN, where are your manuals? And they said, we don't have any manuals. And we asked the World Bank, where are your manuals on how to build a Ministry of Finance? They said, we don't have any. So we really had to work a lot of this out from first principles and called on and found that the knowledge did exist, but it existed in places that we didn't expect. Some of the things that were tried was, first of all, really looking at public finance. How do you manage the finances? And we created a trust fund which donors could put their money into. And then a budget. The budget process is the governance mechanism in a country, which is really the key way to bring accountability in the use of resources, and then transparency to citizens on where the money is being spent. And then rather than relying on this aid complex with its contracting layers, thought about what's the best way to get money directly to citizens so that they can spend the money and manage it. And we devised a system, it's called the National Solidarity Program, where money was taken in block grants, and a block grant of $20,000 to $60,000 given to every village in the country. And the program's now rolled out to 32,000 villages out of the 40,000 villages in Afghanistan. How does it work? The village doesn't have to have the money, but if they want it, they must do three things. They have to elect their village council. A quorum of the village must come together, men and women, to choose their projects. And then they must put accounts up in a public place. And then the system kind of takes care of itself. And it's really provided a platform, a collaborative platform, whereby citizens themselves can take control of their lives. And one of the fantastic things about watching this program is going across the country and talking to Afghan people. And what they often say is, it's not the money. The money's great. Please don't take it away. But it's the fact that we get to make the decisions. We feel trusted to make the decisions, and that makes us feel like a citizen. Now, this particular program is going to have future incarnations, and one of the challenges is how to turn it from a redistributive model to a platform for enterprise entrepreneurship and income generation. Another challenge is how to make it perhaps an instrument of implementation of renewable energies. Even under the most optimistic plans, only 40% of Afghanistan will be covered by the grid. So the other 60% of citizens, how are they going to have electricity? Well, the opportunity is to use solar, microhydro, and wind, and then use this program as a way to distribute it. There are many examples of similar approaches in other countries. In Nepal, even during the Maoist insurgency years, networks of communities came together to implement microhydro programs, do community forestry, set up their community schools. So this bottom-up system building has been taking place. What the National Solidarity Program shows is that you can have a bottom-up participation model as well as some elements that need to be provided top-down. Another example from Afghanistan, the UN said, well, you can have 100 phones and you must pay this much to this telecoms company. And what Dr. Gani argued instead, no, the telecoms company should pay the country, and then did a license system, and there are now 4 million phones in the country, and 70% of the country is covered. And that's generated $1 billion in income in taxes for the country. So another model of how you can get the rules right to unleash entrepreneurialism and generate revenue at the same time. Now, where's this going? There are a number of countries that what we call have an open moment, where a different future is possible if one gets the approach right. And we've set up an institute, the Institute for State Effectiveness, that is working with the leaderships of these countries when they ask for help on how can they craft a pathway which takes this approach of building a state, but in a context of globalization. And we're developing toolkits and manuals and offering them support and really welcome engagement and partnerships with the public, with experts across the world in this endeavor. Thanks very much.
If there are any questions, feel free to use
Since in many cases the governments or quasi-governments are the cause of the lack of the rule of law, how do we get the rule of law to apply to those 4 billion people who you say are not benefiting from it and so are suffering greatly?
Do you want me to? Yeah, excellent question. Thank you. What we are arguing to replace the double failure is a double compact. Because until now, what has happened in terms of aid has been that any government that occupies a seat at the UN has been seen automatically as legitimate. So they sign away the rights of their citizens without a second thought. What we are arguing is that in order for a system to change so that access to rule of law can be provided, there has to be a contract between these rulers and their people first. And then we need to bring about this network governance model in terms of scrutiny of it. So that if one first implication, being recognized as a government does not only give you rights, it gives you obligations. Because today the old notion of sovereignty, that a sovereign just is absolute set of powers vis-a-vis their subjects, is not a notion that is fit for the 21st century. So that's one part, in terms of a fundamental rethinking of the notion of rights and obligations of the government. Second is to take a system view. The first point here is that a lot of the laws in a lot of these countries are actually bad laws. Let me give you an illustration. In some countries, it takes 26 years to acquire the right to a piece of land, to build a house. So what's the net result? People engage in land invasions. So a lot of the slums, 1 billion people around the world live in slums, in urban slums. Is it because there's shortage of land? No. It's because the governments have put such a complex set of measures to deprive the poor from the right to housing. The contrast to this is Singapore. 94% of the housing in Singapore is publicly provided. And it shows that prosperity could be generated. So what's the net cost of this? In a place like Peru, about $26 billion, or what my friend and colleague Hernando de Soto describes as debt capital, namely frozen in assets that cannot be done. So if we think through these arrangements, and again, the last part of this is again about information technology. For instance, when one walks in your building, one can see that any part of the earth that is populated in your system can be accessed in terms of key characteristics of a building or a city or others. Now look at this from the perspective of the poor. The poor actually do not have the right to information of their assets. Their greatest problem is precisely to gain access. One city in India has actually tried this, one state. The state of Andhra Pradesh and the state of Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. Revenue tripled once they introduced e-governance, and corruption dropped very, very substantially. So these are some of the ways that we are thinking, but at the heart of it is this double compact. Okay?
Hey there. So I guess I'm kind of concerned with what you're saying. I typically, viewing the same slices of history that you chose to point out, would not interpret them the same way, I guess. So Europe, I guess it revolves around the concept of sovereignty as you bring it up. So Europe, indeed, it's a fantastic point to point out that they became peaceful after many hundreds of years of being virulently at war and a danger to the world at large. But it seems like you said that it was the economic network effects of the post-war situation that basically was kind of the main explanation for that. And you mentioned the Marshall Plan as well, but it seems like there's a major dimension of the role of military dominance of America in Europe over that time. That the fact that we still have many dozens of military bases scattered throughout Europe, and that European countries have disarmed themselves essentially after many hundreds of years of being the dominant military force on Earth, seems to be more that, well, it's a major facet that certainly would play into their choosing not to make war with each other. They have no more guns. And the other example you gave about the American South, I think it's true that, and I think you kind of picked your examples to support your argument and ignored some counterexamples. But in the American South, it's true that what was happening there was very bad. But one thing that was happening there was that the southern states wanted to keep their independence and their sovereignty, and the American government basically overruled that and imposed a system of laws that I agree probably was good for the people there. But I think that the reason why they turned into, both Europe and the American South, turned into successful states, so to speak, is that they were strong enough to push back. So even though we did take the guns away in Europe, and even though we did take away the sovereignty of the South and American states in general, there's enough internal strength to resist the crushing effects of the dominance that we would otherwise impose. And I think that we have imposed that in other places. And when Ms. Lockhart said, what have we done wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, I think obviously those were the counterexamples that you would not cite. We have crushed them. They did not have the power to resist. And there are other states in the Middle East and around the world and in Central America that we have crushed because they could not resist. And if we go through with the logic that what we did in the post-war years in Europe and in the South is a reasonable logic to apply to the rest of the world, and we ignore the counterexamples where that same logic failed terribly, then like I said, I'm concerned about your politics.
Thank you. Thank you for the observations. First, the use of force. You tried it in Vietnam. It did not result in any transformation. So while the use of force has been used consistently, and also the old imperial system of Europe was precisely used on domination. But India was not transformed. Because it was occupied, it was actually deindustrialized. China was broken to pieces. So if we take just the question that use of force is the necessary precondition of this, your argument would actually be contradicted by a number of other examples. We all pick and choose, so it's not a question. The argument is not that use of force was not an important issue. The question is, once the use of force was there, you have two systems in Europe, an almost perfect experiment. The Soviets on the one side, dominating half of Europe, the NATO alliance as another one. Why is it that the Soviet Union implodes, which uses a lot more force, a lot more repression, and takes away a lot more of the freedoms and liberties? It brings about a total control. And Germany would be the perfect example of that. East Germany was more advanced than West Germany at the time that it was divided. So the second part of the argument actually becomes important, right? That if you have a perfect experiment in Europe, why is it that this half actually becomes transformed? And that half is the one that implodes.
Isn't that just a lesser of two evils argument?
No, it's not a lesser of the two evils argument, because it is a question of an almost perfect, in social sciences, experiments are very rare. But this is an almost perfect example of two sets of contrasts. That two different systems in the way of organizing the economy and polity were experimented with. And a lot more people in 1945 would have been bidding on the success of the authoritarian model, because at that time the distrust of the market was so high compared to a market-based principle of organization in a democratic way, because the distrust of democracy, again, was very high in 1945.
I'm not trying to criticize markets and democracy. I'm trying to criticize the imposition of them.
No, absolutely. But we are not arguing for the imposition. So that it's clear, we agree with you. I mean, if we've given that impression, it's the wrong impression. The question is, how do people embrace certain type of capabilities to break out of a vicious circle? And it's here that whether it's Ireland or whether it's Spain, they were able to break out of certain very, very significant vicious circles. So what we are looking for is never a perfect imposition of one way that things are done, but suggestive mechanisms compared to the major failures that are happening. We are looking for those types of successes that can allow. The argument is not about imposition.
So shouldn't we just share that information with them?
But this is precisely why we've written the book.
Yeah. If I can just add,
No, but you're advocating programs that we should enact in those countries.
not necessarily, no.
Through their own sovereignty.
No, I think you've
programs are-
misunderstood. Just in terms of just a few comments, just to clarify, I think one of the challenges putting in 30 minutes a book that's 200 pages. So I think the first thing is we were very much inspired by John Dewey, the American philosopher, and that the framework we're putting forward is very much in his spirit, which is that the state should perform that which citizens demand that it should be perform for them. So it's the citizens of a particular country that set the agenda as a result of public discussion. So that's really the starting point. So to the extent we're putting a framework forward, it's not a cookie cutter to be imposed. It's a starting point to help clarify and help people understand and to kick off that public discussion. So that's the first point. In terms of picking the examples, we were really looking, because we were so often when we were struggling with these questions on the ground, people said, oh, if you want an example of this, look at Sierra Leone or look at Rwanda. And we found that, well, and when leaders in Afghanistan were struggling with things, they said they got far more from looking at cases of success. They said, we don't bring us Sierra Leone. Show us what happened in Singapore. Show what has happened in Chile. They're really interested to learn. So our starting point for choosing the cases was, let's look at places that have managed to transform successfully. And then try and ask the question of that, is there something common to these experiences? And we actually found that they have a lot of differences between them, and some elements are not relevant, or from a different time or a different context. But there were a series of attributes that were the importance of leadership, the importance of focusing on public finance management, the importance of investing in secondary and tertiary education and training increasing numbers of people. So it's more in that spirit. On the Marshall Plan itself, I think one thing I might direct you to, if you're interested, is, if you haven't found it already, Herbert Simon, who wrote The Science of the Artificial, a book about artificial intelligence, takes a system analysis of the Marshall Plan, why it worked and why it didn't, and he explains how 6 different models were considered for the Marshall Plan. 3 of them were rejected because they said that won't work, and those 3 look very much like the aid system today.
Yes, please. Oh, sorry.
So my question is, from the standpoint of developed countries like the U.S., helping to develop the shall we say, third world countries in the world with limited resources means that the overall prosperity of the US, especially relative to those countries, and probably even in absolute terms, will be lower, just because the resources become more expensive. And right now, to a degree, the prosperity that the US enjoys is at the expense of relatively cheaper resources. So now, how should the US government present this agenda to the citizens where it's a conflict? If you make it much better for them, it will become noticeably worse for the American citizens.
Well, thank you very much. But let me question some of the premises. Because first, there's an assumption that prosperity is a limited size pie. If that assumptions were valid, then we should still be in the beginning of the 20th century, rather than with the kind of fabulous wealth that has been created in the last 100 years. If that argument were valid, then the U.S.'s major trading partners should be poor developing countries. The major trading partners are either Europe or China and Japan. It's what the last 60 years have shown is that prosperous countries actually trade a lot more with each other than with the old model. Africa is not U.S.'s major trading partner. It's Europe, China, Japan, Canada. It's Canada that provides it. The third issue is, again, taking the question, is the U.S. citizen secure? in a world of such inequalities. So from that perspective, the equation changes. Because of that, the argument of pre-9/11 and post-9/11 is a different argument. Prior to 9/11, you could argue that there were two worlds of security. One world where violation of human rights, enslavement of people in mining industries, etc., was acceptable because that was the price of prosperity here. Another argument is that today the world is interlinked. And if we are living in one world, then can we live with these dimensions? Last point, it is not question of aid. It is not taking away from the US in order to create prosperity elsewhere. Because as we illustrated with the rule of law example, a lot of the trapped money that exists in these countries does not become capital to create prosperity for their citizens because of the set of bad rules and regulations and failure of governance. I mean, there's a striking fact, for instance, from the Middle East, where I was 2 days ago. 100 million people, youth, between the ages of 15 and 29, are underemployed, severely underemployed. The cost of this unemployment is $25 billion a year to 11 countries. And 20 to 80% of this can be changed if government efficiency increased. So that is not about introducing more resources. It's about fundamentally rethinking the nature of relationship. And we have a lot more, which again, in 2 minutes probably could not be explained. But thank you for the question.
Hi. How important is democracy and the protection of the minority in your system?
Okay. No, good. Yeah. Fundamentally, again, as Ms. Lockhart earlier argued, our view is based on citizens. And citizen participation is the fundamental issue because the state in the past has been viewed as an organization that is imposed on people. The word was not citizen. The word, until beginning of 20th century, was subject. People in England still refer to themselves symbolically as Her Majesty's subjects. I've fortunately not been subject to anybody, so it's a bit difficult to accept subjugation. Because of this, a democratic process is fundamental to being able to get citizens to agree on a framework. But then we get to the definition of democracy. Democracy is not about an election every 4 years or 5 years, and then ignoring the entire process of governance. So we have to here get to the substance of democracy. Namely, how do we create sets of binding rights and obligations? One manifestation of democracy, ironically, is the number of taxpayers in a country. Because when you have 17,000 people for a population of 30 million that are the taxpayers, that's not a bind of rights and obligations. On minorities, it is fundamental that, again, the question of citizenship be treated as a level playing field. Because the question of historical background is one thing. The question of contemporary reality is creation of this level playing field.
Hey, I had a question about the role of kind of international organizations like the UN and the World Bank and the USAID and the European equivalent of that. It seems like they can hurt as much as they help a lot of the time. And I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about where you think they can act to help and where you think they should stop acting to hurt, and kind of general comments about reform of those organizations would be great. Thank you.
Do you want to start?
You can start.
Okay. First, once I finish, I think Ms. Lockhart will tell you a story about how some $100 million went in smoke. That is an illustration. First on USAID, $1 of you channeled through USAID is worth between 10 and 20 cents on the ground. 80 to 90 cents of it ends up back on the Beltway. That system is not designed to help anybody but the Beltway. So it is a fundamentally inefficient system. It actually creates enormous amount of resentment in the countries that are supposed to be the recipient. There's a new aid security complex that is actually capturing a lot of, one illustration. The U.S. currently provides $2 billion a year in food aid. Next year, it's proposed to become $5 billion because of the food crisis. You know what's the percentage that goes to administration and shipping? Have a guess. 65%, yes, very close. Yeah, fully 65% of this is cost of administration shipping. So I hope I've rested my argument. I've fired more people when I was finance minister supplied through SAID than any other organization because they're totally incompetent. On the UN, politically the UN is indispensable. The UN agencies have major problems of corruption and misgovernance. Again, illustration. 6 of them refuse to disclose their audit reports even to their board of governors. The reason, because their accounting standards are pre-modern. So individual data and system data are mixed up. And because they don't want to change their accounting system, they refuse to disclose information. On the World Bank, again, where we know things inside, the core of this is something called the sovereign guarantee. Every loan of the World Bank is guaranteed by the recipient government. Now that they're shifting to grants, it's changing. But that was the heart of the crisis, because they lent for projects which, 40% of them at one time on banks' internal criteria were dysfunctional. Yet, because the sovereign guarantee was provided, so the failure that we describe is very much a failure of the international system. The contrast of where aid is worked is really been in Spain, in Ireland, Singapore, in Japan, where functioning governments, and this again refers back to the point earlier, so that we are not. The key point is local leadership. It is not the aid system, it is not the outsiders. When people can get their act together and define a set of objectives that are broad, because in politics, you don't cross every T. It's those set of wider objectives. Then movement has really taken place. But enough examples from Marshall Plan to the aid to Ireland and others are available that aid can be a catalyst, but never sufficient in its own right.
And I think what we don't want to say is that these organizations are not needed. There's still very much a role for them. It's a question of rethinking their role in this new 21st century context, particularly the UN. If we didn't have the UN, we'd want to reinvent it. But the problems of misgovernance are very real, and particularly, as Ashrap said, on the UN agency side. The UN Secretariat and its offices that do facilitation of peace agreements are indispensable. But it's some of these agencies that just enormous amounts of money go missing. When I had been in Afghanistan for a few months, I was visiting a village in a remote part of Bamiyan province, and the villagers said, "Could you sit down? We'd like to tell you a story." And I said, "With pleasure. I'd be honored." And they said, "We're going to tell you the story of $150 million going up in smoke." I said, "Really?" And they said, "Yeah. We heard on the radio that this money was coming to our area. We're very excited because we thought it would transform our lives. But a few months later, we heard that the program had finished and not very much had happened. So we went to find out what had happened." And they said, their words, I haven't checked whether their analysis was right, but I have no reason to doubt it. They said, so $150 million went to one agency and 20% went to head office for head office costs, subcontracted to an NGO, 20% went to Washington, subcontracted again to a British NGO, 20% went to the UK, subcontracted again, 20%. Bit of money left at the bottom, used to buy wood from Western Iran, shipped via a trucking cartel. Eventually, a few wooden beams reached our area, but they were too big for the mud walls that we can build, so all we could do was chop them up for firewood. Now, that's one story. Anyone who's spent time in these contexts, and maybe some of you have, would see that this is a story, this happens again and again. And yet the glossy brochures are printed at the end by the aid agency saying it was a successful project. It wasn't. And then recently I went around Afghanistan and spoke to citizens from all parts of the country, and they said, we're really angry. And they weren't. They were angry because all this money had been promised, and they said it had been spent, but they've seen what it's been spent on: big white cars, and I mean, just a lot of waste. And it hasn't been designed. Well, there's some great examples, and this one where it goes to the villages is very popular. But a lot of the money has been spent through a very badly designed system. I think this really requires, and something that citizens could do, is really a scrutiny of budgets. We should be asking to look at the accounts of the UN agencies, of USAID, of, in my country, of DFID, and scrutinize the budgets in the donor countries and in the recipient countries. Much more citizen engagement to oversee budgets. And then rethinking the way that partnerships and assistance is delivered. For example, incredible amounts of wisdom knowledge in this country in firms like Google, in universities. For example, the land grant colleges have enormous wisdom and knowledge on how to build agriculture systems. So finding ways to link this know-how to countries in different ways is going to be part of the solution.
I just wanted to ask a question about rebuilding infrastructure, that type of thing. It seems like that falls into the same category as the aid issues, especially when our country comes in and gets like a no-bid contract and goes in and can rebuild water systems or electricity, things like that. I mean, I don't personally know when I read the news, I don't get that idea of who really gets to make those decisions. And maybe if you had a little perspective to tell me how that process kind of works.
Certainly. First, here in the United States, on infrastructure, the United States gets a grade of C- as the highest grade. Everything else is between F and D-. What's the cost of this? $1.5 trillion are required in the next 5 years to deal with decaying infrastructure. So failure is not a question of out there, it's right here. I mean, you saw the bridge collapse, and you're seeing now the beginning of some of the privatization. The second issue is these large contracts in places like Iraq. The best place to read about this is a government organization called the Government Accountability Office. And what they document is that tremendous amount of money was awarded without deliverables, both on the security side and on other contracting, which is this nexus of number of contracting firms. So the way it's called is called mobilization. They are paid by the number of people that they put on the ground rather than by deliverables. There's a major weakness. For instance, the U.S. Army, between 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 2001, practically cut about 10 to 12,000 jobs in project supervision skills. That's why they cannot supervise this. The other part, basically the model of provision of infrastructure is that first an evaluation takes place. It's called a feasibility study. Then on that basis, a cost estimate is arrived. Once a cost estimate is arrived, then there's a process of bidding among firms. And the question is, the intention is that there should be honest competition. But when a place is a security problem, as these 40 to 60 countries do, the number of firms that actually bid are very small, so it can be 4 to 6. That means that the possibility of collusion among them becomes high. Then the cost gets to be driven sky high. So instead of getting, for instance, in Afghanistan, the neighboring countries were building 1 kilometer of road at between 100 and 150,000. 1 kilometer of road in Afghanistan jumped 400,000. And this is how, instead of building 2,000 kilometers, you end up building 400. This is the key modality, and there's a lot of fairly sophisticated literature. But it brings it back here, again, to question of design. We need to rethink the design of infrastructure really fundamentally, particularly because of the carbon footprint. And here, communities like yours, where have a day of voluntary work, can have enormous information because part of this is to create the databases on transparency of infrastructure. How much is spent where, and this should be really available on a global basis so we can compare and contrast. Thank you.